I picked, the waif, the harlot, and the harridan, right? Those were my three female characters for The Prince of Nothing. I was intentional on my part. It seems to me it has to be intentional. I mean, that seems, you take, those are the three main forms, sexist forms, right, of female representation in a lot of fiction, right? The waif, the harlot, and the harridan. And it seems to me that, wow, if anything shouts, an author self-consciously trying to do something, that would shout it. But to this day, I actually still encounter people saying that, oh yeah, just look at his books. He's got a waif, he's got a harlot, he's got a harridan. Wow, how sexist could this book be, right? So, I mean, stuff that I think obviously shouts the fact that I'm self-consciously exploring these issues, right, for other readers, who have different expectations. It shouts, right, some kind of moral defect on my part. I mean, it's, like I've said before, right? I mean, nothing anyone has written can survive an ill will, right? I mean, as soon as someone takes offense at something you've written,
predisposed to dislike it.
It doesn't matter. I mean, whatever you write from then on in is just going to simply confirm, right, their hypothesis. And so once you cue that, once you trip that wire, so if you're reading a book and you're ideologically primed to find some kind of sin, and then you find that sin, you're like, aha, and then you build a theory, right? Okay, what they say about this writer is true, then everything you read thenceforth is going to actually confirm that theory, right? And over time, as you keep reading, if you stick with the series, you'll start seeing more and more anomalies. They'll build up, right? And you might end up ultimately changing your mind. But for a certain period anyways, it's going to be absolutely impossible to convince a person otherwise, right? Because they'll just, look, it's right there. It's as plain as the nose on your face. I actually came across a website, I can't remember the woman's name, but she had a big picture of my face up on her post. And it was, the subtitle of the face was, isn't this a face you could just start hitting and never stop? Right? And I mean, it was bizarre. But then as I read, I realized that, I mean, she wasn't, a rabid feminist. Anyways, we ended up having this great back and forth. And, and I explained to her that the reason why, so she was basically saying that there was so many things she loved about my books, but the sexism just drove her nuts. And that she would continue reading the series all the way to the end, even though, that part of the books turned her stomach. And I basically made the same arguments I've been making since the very beginning, which is that, first off, the series isn't done yet, right? Second off, endorsement does not equal, or depiction does not equal endorsement, right? Just because you write about a brutal patriarchal culture doesn't mean you're actually waving a flag for that culture. It could be that you're actually critiquing that culture as well. And the big thing I think that impressed her was the fact that what I was trying to depict was just how difficult it is for people to bootstrap themselves out of difficult, chauvinistic social circumstances, right? I mean, it's not the case that a modern feminist just woke up one morning, at the turn of the 19th century, and became fully formed, with all the attitudes that female readers bring to books now. I mean, it just was not the case. So if you're going to adhere to historical realism, which was important to me, even though it's a fantasy series, if you're going to actually tackle these issues, then you're going to have some sort of basically trapped intermediary figures. And that's what I wanted to do from the very beginning, right? Was to show that kicking free of these circumstances is always a generational manner, you know. So Sarah, whom at the end, you might want to cover your ears and go the way I do when I see trailers to movies I want to see. But Sarah was always in the cards, you know, when I was writing Sarah Way at the beginning of the books, right? And I mean, she's, you know, utterly abject, right? Utterly a victim of these oppressive social circumstances. And arguably at the end of the books, Sarah is the only character with autonomy, you know, any sort of meaningful autonomy by the end of the books, right? Although you can argue about the degree to which she's been deceived or what have you, right? I mean, everyone's deceived. Everyone is deceived at some level at the end of the Unholy Consult. And you know, the idea was to show that, you know, transformation in whole over a course of 7 novels, and then also, you know, to use, you know, the difficulties of a brutal patriarchal society to actually acquaint readers with their own, you know, hair trigger moral judgments, which I think I actually did in spades, you know. I mean, for all the fury that those first few books occasioned, I mean, the one thing I got out of it was a lot of brand name recognition. I mean, considering the number of books I sell, I think I have a preposterous amount of notoriety, and because basically Kellis he's the linchpin of the transformation, right? I mean, he's the one who actually rationalizes this patriarchal culture and does away with a lot of the brutalities and chauvinisms that have existed before. But at the same time, I mean, he's purely instrumental, right? I mean, it's not like he's a feminist in any way, shape, or form. It's just that, you know, we need sorceress power. Here we have, you know, all these witches that are being burned and persecuted. I mean, we need these women, right? And so therefore I'm gonna give them power so that we can use them more effectively, right? And so if you were to take a very cynical view of the women's rights movement and say the pivotal role that the First and Second World War played in women's rights, you know, when you have mass conscription and you have a huge chunk of your male population off fighting war, then all of a sudden women become, right, an exploitable resource. You know? And so it pays to actually, you know, give them more economic rights, you know, to actually allow them, you know, entry into all kinds of different, you know, previously male-dominated professions. You know, and there's nothing that's rational about it, except the fact that it pays in some way, shape, or form, right? And then what happens is culture catches up afterwards, right? The culture comes afterwards, gives you this post hoc rationalization for why this is good and this is justice and blah, 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 right? And I mean, that's, you know, the deeper, more troubling point that I was interested in exploring in the books. There's a few points in the books where I lay it all out. I remember being so dismayed at the response to the darkness that comes before that there's a few points in The Warrior Prophet and the Thousandfold Thought where I basically say it, you know, where, for instance, Kellis seduces Esmenet. I mean, it's pretty much all laid out in Kellis's, you know, spiel that he gives Esmenet, right, to empower her. I mean, that's how he manipulates her, right, by recognizing her worth as a woman. And of course, when we finally get to Ishwal, and we discover that, wow, the woman's role has been super rationalized with the Dunyang to the point where they're, you know, literally been turned into brood mares. You know? And that's something actually that's as old. That's almost, you know, as old as anything else in the books. That the notion of the Dunyang only being men, and the question of what's up with the Dunyang women, right? I mean, that's been there for since the beginning. And it's one of those things that when you're getting criticized about a story and you're nowhere near close to the ending, I mean, all you want to do is just jump out and say, look, you know, this is what's going to happen. There's all kinds of points at which I think where I depart from Tolkien and his vision, his mythic vision of the epic, turns on exactly that. The notion that this is really beautiful from a distance, right? But then if you were to actually hang out with Arwen, you know, for a day even, you would realize, oh my God, right? I mean, these guys, you know, I mean, the elves are brutal, right? This is a brutally patriarchal culture. All the cultures in Middle-earth are brutally patriarchal. If you ask yourself, what really is the difference between, you know, the patriarchy in, you know, the 3 Cs versus patriarchy in Middle-earth, and really the biggest difference is simply that, you know, there's sex in my books, right? I mean, you know, if you actually rub out sexuality the way Tolkien does, you know, you desexualize all the contexts, then all of a sudden all that stuff is pretty easy to overlook. But then as soon as you actually sexualize it, right? And that's what I do relentlessly.